Today on History You Should Know, the continuation of the real-life Game of Thrones. This is the Wars of the Roses. Sit on your throne, relax, and enjoy the video in all its glory. London, July 1483. England had a new king. After months of removing, arresting, or killing his enemies at court, Richard III seemed unstoppable. All he had to do was get rid of anyone who might claim his throne. He had outlived his father and brothers. No man could take him down. No man. Pero para tuluyang matapos ang kwentong ito, kailangang bumalik tayo sa umpisa. 1455. Aside from the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, may isa pang importanteng nangyari noon. The marriage of a 12-year-old girl. The man she married was named Edmund Tudor, half-brother of the Lancastrian king Henry VI, and the young girl was named Margaret Beaufort. As the great-granddaughter of the Duke of Lancaster, Margaret was always around nobles, and throughout the Wars of the Roses, she was always in the background. Noong 1456, nabuntis si Margaret. Pero bilang sundalo kay Henry VI, hindi inabutan ni Edmund ang anak nila. 3 months after his death, the 13-year-old Margaret, I repeat, 13-year-old Margaret gave birth to their child. A son they named Henry Tudor. Considering her age, it was a difficult, painful, and traumatic birth. She never had any other children. But everything Margaret did was to secure her son's future. Sound familiar? At 14, she married Sir Henry Stafford, an influential man in Henry VI court, while her son stayed with his uncle Jasper Tudor. Pero noong matalo ang Lancastrians at naging hari si Edward IV, ibinigay ang lupa ng anak niya kay George, Duke of Clarence. And then, Henry VI became king again for a year. That was in episode 4. The Lancastrians were back, only to be defeated again a year later. And one of the casualties was Margaret's second husband. In 1470, in order to save her son Henry, Margaret sent him away from England. She wouldn't see her son for the next 14 years. But Margaret is the ultimate survivor. In another genius move, Margaret married another influential man, Thomas Stanley, a very influential man in Edward IV's court. That's already 2 husbands who are both influential in different courts. Sa mga sumunod na taon, sinikap niyang maibalik sa anak niya ang lupang nawala. And when King Edward IV was about to give it back, he suddenly died. Finally, in 1483, when Richard took the throne, she was able to remain in court, even carrying the train of Queen Anne's gown, and her husband, Thomas Stanley, carried Richard III's mace during the coronation, summer of 1483. Over at the Tower of London were 2 important guests. The 12-year-old Edward, Prince of Wales, and 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury. Mga anak ng dating hari at kuya ni King Richard III na si Edward IV. After declaring his older brother's marriage as illegitimate, with the flimsiest evidence, by the way, episode 5, Richard overtook the boys and became king himself. Now, to protect them from the turmoil, King Richard thought it best to keep them in the tower together. The boys were guarded and had servants attend to them 24/7. Maraming nakakakita sa kanilang naglalaro sa gardens tuwing hapon. At least until June 1483. And then a few weeks after Richard's coronation the following month, which is July, the princes were never seen again. Not in the grounds, not in the tower. The boys suddenly disappeared. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to them. The tale of the princess in the tower is one of history's most enduring mysteries and source of great debate. The most common speculation is murder, and the most common method thrown around is they were smothered as they slept. But the real question is, who did it and why? The first mention of the princess being murdered was in 1486. It took 3 years for the public to know something even happened to the boys. 3 decades later, in the early 1500s, St. Thomas More, and then later on continued by his nephew, wrote about what could have happened to the princess, claiming they were most likely murdered by the order of their uncle. King Richard III has always been the prime suspect, but why? Because people say that he had the most to gain by removing his nephews, because they could be potential challengers to his claim to the throne if they grow older. A couple of years later, a certain playwright read Thomas More's account and used it as the basis for his new play, a story of a power-hungry, child-murdering hunchback king. The character Richard III was immortalized as one of literature's greatest anti-heroes, and the playwright went on to be enshrined as the greatest in history, William Shakespeare. Pero may mga nagsasabi rin na propaganda lang yun laban kay Richard at iba talaga ang may sala. Richard had a good track record up to that point and he had no reason to kill his nephews, and the following regime did everything they could to smear his name. In 1674, almost 200 years after the incident, may nahanap na mga buto sa Tower of London. At the time, they were believed to be the princess, so they were put in an urn and buried in Westminster Abbey. In 1933, an investigation was made on the bones. It was flawed since DNA testing wasn't as advanced as it is today. But during Queen Elizabeth's reign, the science was advanced, but she didn't allow any tests to be done on the bones. However, in October 2022, King Charles III declared his support to do DNA testing on the remains. We may finally make progress on this 540-year-old mystery. Pero kahit ano man ang nangyari, dalawang batang walang kasalanan ang naglaho parang bula. Filled with grief and remorse about her sons, the former Queen Elizabeth Woodville vowed to avenge her sons and get rid of Richard by any means necessary. But there's no one left to challenge Richard III. If only there were any Lancastrians left. The only person she could turn to was someone who also knew what it was like to be away from her child, Margaret Beaufort. Bilang dalawang ina na puno ng galit at maraming pera. And if you watch Filipino teleseries, you know they don't mess around. They realized that sticking together would be their best chance. Margaret could get her son back, and with it, she could offer Elizabeth the revenge she needed. How? Because even if Henry Tudor was a minor noble and far down the line of succession, technically, siya ang pinaka-senior at huling Lancastrian noble na natitira. Elizabeth Woodville's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, is the daughter of the late King Edward IV, ate noong princess in the Tower. To seal the alliance, both mothers agreed to marry their children to one another. On paper, this coup sounded impossible, but King Richard helped their cause. His path to the throne was paved with arrests, exiles, and murders, including nobles who were his allies. And in a twist of fate, namatay ang kaisa-isang anak at tagapagmana ni Richard noong 1484. Tinipon ni na Margaret at Elizabeth ang mga galit na nobles. They were so unified in their anger towards the king that it didn't matter if they were Yorkists or Lancastrians. Richard had to go. And finally, they had someone to rally behind, Henry Tudor. Thanks to Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville. It's 1485. After a few failed attempts of trying to go back to England, Henry Tudor finally lands in Wales. Together with an army, he marches towards London. Richard meets them halfway. There's only room for one king on the throne. The final battle of the Wars of the Roses is about to begin. Finale na! See you! Follow for more, and boom!